All right. Well, time to get started. I appreciate everybody joining in the time today. This is a follow on the conversation we had yesterday. When you are in the spirit and mood of evangelism, as we should always be, part of it is what are we evangelizing people to? And that's really, really important. And we spent quite a bit of time talking about a topic yesterday of authority and how truth is transmitted, and to make sure that we had a refresher on that. That's not likely with people in this room that I was telling you anything you didn't already know. But it's good to remind ourselves of it. And frankly, every generation has to learn it. Every generation has to hear it. And sometimes I would say people know what we believe, but they don't know why we believe it. And it's important to go through those things. So just to kind of remind you some anchoring we did yesterday, really emphasizing the fact that God is God, and that means something. That He is in charge. He has the authority. He is the king. We traced some of the history of things that related to authority and how authority is conveyed from the early church to the emergence of the Catholic Church to what happened in the Reformation and then the Restoration, and even to the point of heretic hunting in the 20th century, things like that. And so we remind ourselves that has been a hot topic all along, and we need to be firmly grounded in a soulful understanding that God has the authority. He is a monarch. He has conveyed it to his son. His son has conveyed it to the apostles. And then the apostles, by revelation, because that's the only way we can know God's will for our lives, has conveyed it to the word that we have. And that's how authority flows. And understanding that and understanding that's the only source of authority is key. Generally, when you talk to people that are of a Christian persuasion, they would agree that God has all the authority. This is not the problem. The problem is to what degree do they agree that God has all the authority? And we need to think about that as we consider truth and how it is portrayed. And then this idea that because God is in control and he has provided revelation, he did so, he's not the author of confusion, that truth is knowable and that there is a way to discover truth. And that most often the best way to discover truth is common sense. And while there are systems and methods and approaches to that, the unbiased mind can simply use a common sense to come to the right conclusion. So that's a refresher that we had yesterday. As with every generation, there are challenges to the concepts of authority, and they're going to vary from time to time. Typically, they tend to follow what's going on in the secular world. We understand that. And so there are some contemporary concerns, some contemporary challenges that we're dealing with that have to do with this concept of authority and truth and how it is conveyed. We're going to look at a few things. We're going to look at a bad example of where there is sort of being a restatement of how authority is conveyed. We're going to talk about a good example, and what I mean by that is it's always good to know the times, know how people think. And so we might be better able to influence them with ways today that might not have been the ways in the past that were as effective. So we're going to talk about that a little bit. We're going to give you a case study in a disaster, and that is how this has gone really, really bad on a particular topic. And then finally, we're going to spend a little time talking about unity while we're working through these particular topics. And so, some contemporary concerns. Let's see here. There it is. Searching for the pattern. Now, as I came of age in the early 80s, there was an emerging thing going on in the church. Up to that point, it had not only been an emphasis on the authority of God, it had been authority, 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 authority. I grew up in an environment that often was not particularly helpful at times because the answer to any question was because I said so. And that's not an effective way necessarily to endear faith within people. And that was a problem. And so there began to be a generation that came on, and these are individuals that now probably 10 years older than I am, that began challenging this. And like it often happens in theological issues, a reaction becomes an overreaction. And we have clearly seen that happen. There's been a variety of attempts to break down the model of authority. And I'm just going to talk about at least one way that this is sometimes done. There was clearly a recognition, and I think we all experienced it, that there is a biblical view of unity and that we need to have unity. And the history of Christianity has not been one of unity. Now, some will point at Church of Christ and talk about all the different fractions and everything that have occurred, but actually we've done a lot better than all the others on this, and we could have a discussion about that. But there was a recognition that there was these kind of all these fragments, and we need to have unity. So we need a different way of looking at things. And so they would reference, 1 Corinthians 1:10. Should be of the same mind and the same judgment. Why are we having all these arguments? So that would come along. Or Ephesians 4, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. Why are we having all these debates, etc.? And they would think even about John 17 and the prayer in the garden. You remember Jesus prayed for the apostles, and then starting verse 20, he prays for you and I. I pray for all those that will believe on me through their word, that they may be one, Father, as you are in me and I in you, that they may be one in us. And so they're like, there's a hue and cry for unity. And in their experience growing up in the church, and as they became more mature adults, and sometimes preachers and professors, they looked around and they said, there's all this disunity, there's a problem, we've got to do something different. And that's an awful lot of what happened beginning in the 80s. We use this term, I don't think they would use this term, but we use this term ecumenical, right? Is this idea of, well, let's all just figure out how to get along. Well, they ran right against the principles of authority and where the lines are drawn. And as they did that, they began thinking about, we've got to have a different way of telling this story. Some of them have some very, very heartfelt pleas about having difficulty and arguments with people that have good hearts and good minds. They'll talk about they went to Bible camp and there would be differences. They would talk about they would go to college and there would be differences. And these were good people, and we couldn't ever get there, so there must be something wrong with the system because two good people should be able to agree. And so then, instead of doing the work to get there, they decided to break the framework. And that's an awful lot of what happened. And so this is what you'll get. You'll get, oh, well, there's all these rules. There's the hermeneutic, command, example, necessary inference, and they'll go through all the rules, and the rules are causing us a problem. The mindset of a blueprint or a pattern is causing us the problem. And they're thinking about all that and trying to figure out how to work around it, and so they'll start saying we need to take those things apart. And the way they'll do it is they'll start by ridiculing the rules. One writer has a decision tree on a particular topic. And he goes, down one, and then another, and then another, and then another, and this, then that, if this, and that. And then he would say, this is too complicated. This is too complicated. Why do we operate with this set of rules? I was hearing Ben Carson speak a few years ago. Ben Carson, I think besides his political face, is a brain surgeon. And he was talking to the audience, and he said, okay, everybody raise your left hand. So everybody went like this. And then he paced back and forth on the stage, and he walked through the 45 steps that just occurred in your brain to raise that. And there was all these things. Now, I don't know about you, but when I raise my hand, I don't walk through 45 steps. It's just common sense. And what they're doing and what they've done with this is they've taken common sense that we all naturally do anyway, and they've tried to ridicule it. And it's a bit of a problem, and we're seeing it. And it comes across as this idea of, well, we got to break down the authority structure. We've got to break down the blueprint. We've got to break down the pattern, all of which are biblical topics. And it's all driven by an ecumenical desire. We want to not draw lines. Now, I know that God expects us to draw lines. In fact, even in the prayer in the garden in John 17, there's a line drawn. He prayed that there may be one, Father, as you are in me and I in you, that they may be one where? In us. There's a box driven, and inside is the Father and the Son. That's a line. And you've got to get inside that line to be able to have the unity. And so there are lines that are drawn. I remember David, when he made his famous census sin in 2 Samuel 23. And at one point, there was this individual who offered to give him the land and the altar to do it. And what did he say? I will not do a sacrifice to God anything that costs me nothing. Now, there may have been some very good relationship reasons to be endearing to that man and let him give him that gift. But he said, no, I'm going to draw a line. I have to draw a line. And sometimes lines have to be drawn. There may be discussions about how we draw the lines and how we conduct ourselves around lines, but lines are a principal part of God's authority. So, frustrated with complicated rules, which I think is a smokescreen. We talked yesterday about common sense. Worried about unity. Instead, it's more about union. Let's just all not worry about these details and let everything go the way that we like. I don't know how many times I've had a conversation with people about instrumental music or about women's role or about partaking the Lord's Supper on only on Sundays. And the answer is, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm just not going to be critical of somebody else. You see, that is a different kind of mindset that says, postmodernism, you have your truth, I'll have mine, and everything will be fine. And so that's very much what is going on. Now, they come along with an alternative proposal. And it's this idea of God inviting us into the story instead of looking for what God requires of us. By the way, the language of what God requires for us is not the language we should be using. The language we should be using is what pleases God. And there's a huge difference between those things. Because what God requires of us is sort of like, well, let me figure out where the boundaries are. No, that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in what pleases God and how do we know it, and going through that process. But they want to invite you into the story of Jesus. We'll talk a little bit about this on the next page, but the idea being grace-centered and all those kinds of things. And the issue is that, as they do that, they want to focus on the story and get rid of all the rest. And that's part of the problem that we have. So, and then it becomes, well, we just need to look at everything through this, now listen to this carefully, a theological framework. Well, it's a little dangerous to look at things through a theological framework. And let me give you an example. Do you think lamb plays an important part of the theological framework of the sacrifice of Christ? I do. I could have a lot of conversation about that. I could teach series of sermons on the Passover, the sheep, the sacrifice, going from the Old Testament all the way up through. I could find a strong argument for the theological framework of lamb. So why don't we have it in the Lord's Supper? I mean, there's a theological framework for it. I mean, it's a communion fellowship. Why not do that? You have to go beyond the theological framework, and you have to look for what pleases God. And this is, and you can go through many examples of this. So watch out for these concepts of discounting the blueprint, discounting the pattern, which is a discount of authority, by the way, and this idea of just a theological framework. Because the net result of that is exactly what happened in the days of the judges. Every man does that which is right in his own eyes. And so we'll be battling this the rest of my life. And as we talk about these things, we need to return people to thinking about 100% we're in a monarchy, and we're inquisitive and constantly looking for what pleases God. Now, more optimistically, there is a second thing that is going on. And I think this has been somewhat in response. I said there was a reaction, there was an overreaction. Now trying to figure out where the right place to be on this and in this pleasing God approach. Part of our society, particularly the millennials and younger generations, are anti-institutional. Let's kind of define what that means, by the way. Just as a side point, we talk about the three great institutions that God instituted, right? The home, the church, and the government. But I don't think that's what they mean by, they're anti-institutional. What they mean by that is, again, this framework that says the institution has all power and authority to say everything, and whatever they say goes. There's not a discussion about it and a learning of it and an expectation. And that's very much what is happening. There is a distrust of institutions that occurs with the younger generations. So we have to be able to talk about it in ways that makes more sense to them. We should not be thinking about things like the church teaches, right? We shouldn't be thinking about things quite as much as because I said so. It very much needs to be in the context of let's sit down side by side and look at this together as individuals, relational, rather than corporate hierarchy. And by the way, I'm a banker in a corporation, so I understand that too. But corporate hierarchy, telling it much more of a interwoven relationship kind of approach to what is going on. And so you also see within this generation, and some of this is coming from the prior slide, well, we want to be grace-centered. Well, I grew up full well understanding grace. I don't know where people were that said we weren't grace-centered. But to make a bifurcation between being grace-centered and a blueprint is a false bifurcation. There is, in fact, I would say the blueprint is given because of grace. The pattern is provided because of grace. And so, again, being sure we're talking about being grace-centered, but also not letting that being talked about as a bifurcation with the blueprint. And so, as you think about this, rather than thinking about the command, example, necessary, inference discussion, thinking about exegesis, that's using common sense, seeing things in their initial historical context, but then applying them as the principles apply, and that's how we interpret Scripture. Having that conversation goes well with the times, and it still gets you to the right place, still gets you to the right blueprint, it gets you to the right pattern. I do want to spend a minute talking about Ephesians 4:15 because I do think if I'm honest with my 60 years in the church, I do think there are some elements of Ephesians 4:15 we've missed, and they are increasingly important. So this is the idea of teaching the truth in love, and so that's very, very much key. I think there have been times where we have misunderstood what it means to teach the truth in love. So it goes a little bit like this. Well, here's a person that's wrong. They're going to be lost. I love souls. Let me tell them how it is. And that's what happens, right? Now, and you may even say it in a loving way. That's not teaching the truth in love. That's not what that means. Because the word love there is our agape service concept. And it's the idea of seeing things through the eyes of the other. And a lot of times, whether we're talking about a moral issue, whether we're talking about a doctrinal issue, we have the mindset that says, this person's wrong. They have a problem with God. I need to tell them the truth. And at one level, I appreciate that. But that's not the kind of love that we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is, how can I, in that person's best interest, arrange things so that they have the best opportunity to accept the truth? And there is a huge difference between those two things. I can go along spouting a lot of truth. It might make me feel better, and it may even be accurate, and it may even be from a heartfelt intent of love, and it will do no good because I haven't done the work to understand. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. If you, and I've done a whole study on this before, but if you kind of look at the etymology of the word agape, how it grew up as a noun in the Christian age and has become much more post-Christ than it was pre-Christ, even in the language, you realize that the Christian brand was agape, And some of that was brotherly love. They saw, the love between members of the church, which was awesome. But it's also this idea of how you treat others where you are considering their best interests. I'm afraid at times, and this is really important for evangelism, we have thrown our pearls before swine because we didn't do the work to understand the best way for them to receive it. Because, see, sometimes you may need to know something right now, but it may well be true there is no way in the world you're going to accept that. Well, what's the use of telling them? You're, the only person that's trying to make feel better is me. The trick is, let me understand that person, and how can I best get in a situation where they're most likely, have a higher probability of accepting the truth. That's what it means to teach the truth in love. And I think over the last few decades, we've kind of learned that's very, very important. Jesus at times had things to say to them, and they were what? You are not yet able. You are not yet able. And we need to have the mindset as we talk with people to have a discernment to see if they are able yet to receive the truth, because otherwise you're casting your pearls before swine. Now, disaster case study. If you had asked me 20, 25 years ago what was going to be the next thing to kind of fall in the church, I would have said instrumental music was going to be the big challenge. And I think that was kind of understood. It has stunned me that there has been this shift in women's role. And this kind of emphasizes for you what happens when you get this sort of ecumenical mindset and bias. There's a phrase that we use in business that culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? Once you get on a culture of being sort of ecumenical, breaking down the blueprint, it doesn't matter what the truth is. It's going to chew it up. It's going to spit it out. I'll say this as a headline, and it is fairly strong. But the conversations that are going on about women's role are pure fraud. Literally. The evidences that are being presented are pure fraud. And if you don't know that and you haven't looked at it and investigated, be sure you know, because this is not like, there's some evidences here. The evidence that's being presented are lies. That's literally what's going on. And that's part of the problem that we have. So, of course, there's a number of things we can think about. There's this concept of equality. Remember, this is a theological framework. Remember that bias. So you go to the whole discussion of neither male nor female, Jew nor Greek, etc. And you go through that. And so, there's a theological framework. So we need to throw away any of these other things that get in the way of it. Won't spend a lot of time on it, but be sure you understand the difference between role and value. There's a huge difference between role and value. I remember having this conversation with somebody, and And they said, well, you can't separate role for value. I said, well, if that's the case, you got a problem with the Trinity because they're all equal God, but they have different roles. And in fact, that's what 1 Corinthians 11, the first few verses, tell us that even though Christ and the Father are one, and Christ is equally God, the Father's the head of Christ. That's a role difference. And then in the same sentence is male spiritual leadership, etc. So be sure you understand that. But let's just kind of talk about how far this gets. So you've got 2,000 years of history where nobody has misunderstood this. There's not been any misunderstanding here. So from a history perspective, you don't have any problems with that. You have a text in 1 Timothy 2 that is anchored in creation. Literally, it's anchored in creation. It's anchored in the distinctions between the genders, where it talks about childbirth. I mean, this is not some kind of contemporary, etc. And yet, what they want to do is they want to make it highly occasional. Now, when you hear the word occasional, be careful. There's a sense in which things are occasional, but some want to make it so occasional they dismiss it. And so the occasional elements, they'll say, Timothy is in Ephesus. Paul is writing to Timothy to address a specific problem in Ephesus. And then they want to localize it all the way down to that. Never mind that it's been understood differently for 2,000 years, but they want to localize it all the way down to that. So there's been some writers that have come out, those that have spoken. And generally there's, besides the unity element and the equality, there's been two pieces of evidence that they have really linked to. In historical artifacts, there are things called inscriptions. An inscription might be, some kind of engravement on some stone monument. More likely, it might be letters that have been preserved, personal letters, or official letters, official documents. So anything that's kind of written that can be looked at. And there have been found 3 of these letters that indicate a preeminence or preeminence of women. And so they will bring these out and say, you see, in Ephesus, there was a mindset of what we today would call feminism. And Paul is writing this in a very occasional and a very specific way for Timothy to limit it. He did not intend for it to apply. It's purely occasional. Now, there has been a book written by professors at Baylor University. By the way, if you want this, you can come look at this. It's academics doing what's called an academic review. And they're weighing the evidence. Now, keep in mind, it's Baylor University. It's not even members of the church, right? What they call it? Words like frivolous, disingenuous, obscure. One of the reasons, there's 3 inscriptions that show what I did. There's a total of 6,000 inscriptions that have to do with patriarchal, and the 6,000 are all very consistent with the rest of the Greek world. In fact, likely they say that these 3 different things they looked at was sort of what we would call the coming of age of a young woman being written about in prominent terms because she turned 14 or whatever it might be, right? And so, it's so flagrant that even professors who tend to be a little bit tamping down on things are saying this is fraud. This is fraud to try to come out and say this. Another example is. I'll have it up here after you come look at it. It's called Women in the Church. And I can't even pronounce the author's last names, but you're welcome to come look at it here. What's that? Kostenberger, yeah. And it's a scholarly book, but these things are very well laid out. The other thing that is done, and again, think about this in the context of, I say I follow authority, but I've got an agenda, and so then I have a view of evidence. Is the phrase, we call it usurp authority, comes from a particular Greek word. And that Greek word has some etymology with a different usage that means murder. And so they're saying, oh, well, all Paul is doing is he's writing and he's saying that you women shouldn't murder the men. You shouldn't have this violence view within the church. And that's what's going on. Now, that's a meaning of that word that has a fairly limited etymology, but it exists. And then there's the normal word that we think about as usurp authority. All it is a homonym. So let me give you an example. Ear of corn. Do you think of hearing when you hear ear of corn? I mean, it's a completely different use of the word, right? And the professors, they're actually more patient than I am about this. They're like, this is basic linguistics. We're missing this. Or let's use the word race. The current presidential race will have impacts about race. Now, I just used the word race twice, but nobody confuses the use of those two words, right? They are very clear in what's going on. And so they're almost indignant, and I'm indignant when I read it. What is the concern is, why do people get there? And they get there because they've lost the commitment to 100% authority of the monarchy, and they get there because they have a particular ecumenical goal. And the other thing that's so interesting about this one is you talk about following the culture of the day, right? I mean, what Romans 12, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind. And this whole idea of not getting caught up in the world today, and yet this is absolutely following precisely what the world has said about things. And I'm not against women in the workplace or anything like that. Probably 60% of the women in my the employees in my bank are women, which is great. But that's a different context than a discussion of the church and the way God designed the church. So just be aware and understand that sometimes people roll out evidences. Now, let's be sure we do this. There's an order in which conversations should happen. It's correct to say the people that are promoting this have an ecumenical mindset and a bias of the mind to achieve a particular goal. That is absolutely accurate. That should not be the headline. The headline should be, the evidence that is being presented is fraudulent. It is a misrepresentation of the truth. And those that say those things are doing so with ill intent, it appears, because the evidence is so fraudulent. If this was a court of law and somebody brought this evidence in there, and it was a prosecutor or a defense, they would be disbarred. That's how bad this is. It's horrific because of this whole mindset that is there. So be aware, and that's an example of how at times these things could come out. All right, let's conclude with something considerably more cheery. Unity and judgment. We do need to have unity to the best extent that we can. While mistakes have been made, we should be focused on pleasing God against the culture. Aeon's don't be conformed to the world in Romans 12. You know that word's not cosmos, right? That word is the idea, aeon, which is the age or the culture or the day. And you talk about the challenge for us. We talked about this yesterday. We're so impressed with our human achievement. The culture, don't be conformed to the culture. If somebody suggests to do something different in the church, and they want to study that, and it is exactly along the lines of what's going on in the world, my spidey sense goes up immediately. Because that's what it's saying, right? Nobody came up with this women's role thing 200 years ago. It wasn't we studied this out and it's different 200 years ago. It's following the culture of the day. And so we need to focus on pleasing God and not the culture. Remaining mission focused. I was an elder over in the Carolinas for about 20 years. And during that time, we started a new congregation and grew it. And it grew very well. I won't tell you necessarily it was because we were fabulous at baptizing people. It was more about everybody moved into Charlotte. That's basically what was going on. But the interesting thing about it is when people move from someplace else, they have different ideas. And you get and there you don't have nearly as many churches, so everybody is in one congregation. They can't go figure out which one to go to. They're all in one place, and so you end up having these conversations where I think we had 6 members. Our last church was what we would refer to as non-institutional, and there were at least 2 families that had come from a Christian church. So you've got an interesting kind of group that's in there, and so you have these conversations. You have to be very careful that they don't get in your way. And it may be a little bit easier here or harder depending on your perspective, but having a conversation says, well, we don't do that here. I would love to sit down and discuss that with you. By the way, we got this big work to do. Let's get on with it, right? Rather than it becoming the focus, because sometimes it could become the focus, and all you ever do is talk about disagreements and things. So remain mission focused, remain evangelism focused, consistent with our theme. And then there's going to be disagreements. I sort of have this 3-step approach is when I start talking with people when I disagree. Looking at the evidence, is it fraud? Because I showed it. There's fraud that goes on in these conversations, right? But people, you work with them, you try to understand them, you give them the benefit of the doubt, you talk through these things as best you can, you show them the text, can you get there and work through it. But even when you disagree, can we work together? Again, I mentioned at Gold Hill Road, we had 2 families that came from an instrumental music Christian church. They didn't have any problem with instrumental music and said so. But they were fine worshiping with us. It was okay. They weren't causing any problem. Great. We can work together with that. Over time, some of them changed their mind, which is interesting as you think about that. So, and then never stop talking. I do think one of the things that has happened in the church is the productive debates stopped. There's some key words I have there, by the way. The productive debates stopped. Debate is a good thing, and if you get some people together that are talking about things, maybe even things that are more narrower focus, like the work of the Holy Spirit or something like that, and they're having discussions about it, they're learning from each other. That's productive. I'm afraid what's happened now is everybody's going into their corner. I've got my corner here, you got your corner, and the talking has stopped. And I think some of that would be very helpful. I was thinking about this this morning, and I kind of convicted myself. So I live in Brentwood, and as soon as I come out of my neighborhood, there's a Brentwood Church of Christ. Now, by the way, that's not Brentwood Hills Church of Christ. There's a Brentwood Church of Christ. I knew it just because I looked at it online when I first got here. It's what we would call a non-institutional. Well, I've never talked to those people. Maybe I need to. Maybe I go down and talk to them and meet them, and more of that needs to happen, and then that will generate unity. But remember, doing it in love. Yes, sir. So first of all, get in your mind, is there fraud going on here? Because that exists, right? Then the second thing is, can we work together? I'm not necessarily recommending this book, but years ago, F. LaGard Smith wrote a book called Who's My Brother? And in it, he talked about the different degrees of connections that we have with people. And there's a point in time where we may be pretty close, but we just can't worship together because there's one element of something that's not the same. That's vastly different than huge differences on different things. So, but can we work together? And then the third one was never stop talking. Never stop talking. All right, we're about out of time, but any questions or comments or thoughts before we dismiss? All right, I appreciate you listening, and keep your eyes on the authority. That's the important message. Thank you. Yeah. 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 That's a very good point. Very good point. Keep talking. Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Appreciate your attendance.